Funeral Orations by St. Gregory the Theologian, translated by C.G. Browne and others. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Oration 43, Part 3. Affairs at home being now settled to his mind, in a way that faithless men who did not know him would have thought impossible, his designs became greater and took a loftier range. For while all others had their eyes on the ground before them, and directed attention to their own immediate concerns, and, if these were safe, troubled themselves no further, being incapable of any great and chivalrous design or undertaking, he, moderate as he was in all other respects, could not be moderate in this, but with head erect, casting his mental eye about him, took in the whole world over which the word of salvation has made its way. And when he saw the great heritage of God, purchased by his own words and laws and sufferings, the holy nation, the royal priesthood, in such evil plight that it was torn asunder into 10,000 opinions and errors, and the vine brought out of Egypt and transplanted, the Egypt of impious and dark ignorance, which had grown to such beauty and boundless size that the whole earth was covered with the shadow of it, while it overtopped mountains and cedars, now being ravaged by that wicked wild boar, the devil, he could not content himself with quietly lamenting the misfortune, and merely lifting up his hands to God, and seeking from him the dispersion of the pressing misfortunes, while he himself was asleep, but felt bound to come to her aid at some expense to himself. For what could be more distressing than this calamity, or call more loudly on one whose eyes were raised aloft for exertions on behalf of the common weal? The good or ill success of an individual is of no consequence to the community, but that of the community involves of necessity the like condition of the individual. With this idea and purpose, he who was the guardian and patron of the community, and, as Solomon says with truth, a perceptive heart is a moth to the bones, unsensitiveness is cheerily confident, while a sympathetic disposition is a source of pain, and constant consideration wastes away the heart. He, I say, was consequently in agony and distress from many wounds. Like Jonah and David, he wished in himself to die, and gave not sleep to his eyes, nor slumber to his eyelids. He expended what was left of his flesh upon his reflections, until he discovered a remedy for the evil, and sought for aid from God and man, to stay the general conflagration, and dissipate the gloom which was lowering over us. One of his devices was of the greatest service. After a period of such recollection as was possible, and private spiritual conference, in which, after considering all human arguments, and penetrating into all the deep things of the Scriptures, he drew up a sketch of pious doctrine, and by wrestling with and attacking their opposition, he beat off the daring assaults of the heretics, overthrowing in hand-to-hand struggles by word of mouth those who came to close quarters, and striking those at a distance by arrows winged with ink, which is in no wise inferior to inscriptions on tablets, not giving directions for one small nation only, like that of the Jews, concerning meat and drinks, temporary sacrifices, and purifications of the flesh, but for every nation and part of the world, concerning the word of truth, the source of our salvation. Again, since unreasoning action and unpractical reasoning are alike ineffectual, he added to his reasoning the succour which comes from action. He paid visits, sent messages, gave interviews, instructed, reproved, rebuked, threatened, reproached, undertook the defence of nations, cities, and individuals, devising every kind of succour, and procuring from every source specifics for disease, a second Basil, an architect of the divine tabernacle, applying every material and art to the work, and combining all in a harmonious and surpassing beauty. Why need I enter into further detail? We were assailed again by the anti-Christian emperor, that tyrant of the faith, with more abundant impiety and a hotter onset, inasmuch as the dispute must be with a stronger antagonist, like that unclean and evil spirit, who when sent forth upon his wanderings from man, returns to take up his abode in him again with a greater number of spirits, as we have heard in the Gospels. This spirit he imitated, both in renewing the contest in which he had formerly been worsted, and in adding to his original efforts. He thought that it was a strange and insufferable thing that he, who ruled over so many nations, and had won so much renown, and reduced under the power of impiety all those round about him, and overcome every adversary, should be publicly worsted by a single man, and a single city, and so incur the ridicule not only of those patrons of ungodliness by whom he was led, but also, as he supposed, of all men. It is said that the king of Persia, on his expedition into Greece, was not only urged to immoderate threats, by elation at the numbers of every race of men which in his wrath and pride he was leading against them, but thought to terrify them the more, by making them afraid of him, in consequence of his novel treatment of the elements. A strange land and sea were heard of, the work of the new Creator, and an army which sailed over the dry land, and marched over the ocean, while islands were carried off, and the sea was scourged, and all the other mad proceedings of that army and expedition, which, though they struck terror into the ignoble, were ridiculous in the eyes of men of brave and steadfast hearts. There was no need of anything of this kind in the expedition against us, but what was still worse and more harmful, this was what the Emperor was reported to say and do. He stretched forth his mouth unto heaven, speaking blasphemy against the Most High, and his tongue went through the world. Excellently did the inspired David before our days thus describe him who made heaven to stoop to earth, and reckoned with the creation that supermundane nature, which the creation cannot even contain, even though in kindness to man it did to some extent come among us, in order to draw to itself us who were lying upon the ground. Furious indeed were his first acts of wantonness, more furious still his final efforts against us. What shall I speak of first? Exiles, banishments, confiscations, open and secret plots, persuasion, where time allowed, violence, where persuasion was impossible. Those who clung to the Orthodox faith, as we did, were extruded from their churches. Others were intruded, who agreed with the imperial soul-destroying doctrines, and begged for testimonials of impiety, and subscribed to statements still harder than these. Burnings of presbyters at sea, impious generals, not those who conquered the Persians, or subdued the Scythians, or reduced any other barbaric nation, but those who assailed churches, and danced in triumph upon altars, and defiled the unbloody sacrifices with the blood of men and victims, and offered insult to the modesty of virgins. With what object? The extrusion of the patriarch Jacob, and the intrusion in his place of Esau, who was hated even before his birth. This is the description of his first acts of wantonness, the mere recollection and mention of which even now rouses the tears of most of us. Accordingly, when after passing through all quarters he made his attack in order to enslave this impregnable and formidable mother of the churches, the only still remaining unquenched spark of the truth, he discovered that he had been for the first time ill-advised. For he was driven back like a missile which strikes upon some stronger body, and recoiled like a broken hawser. Such was the prelate of the Church that he met with. Such was the bulwark by which his efforts were broken and dissipated. Other particulars may be heard from those who tell and recount them, from their own experience, and none of those who recount them is destitute of this full experience. But all must be filled with admiration who are aware of the struggles of that time, the assaults, the promises, the threats, the commissioners sent before him to try to prevail upon us, men of judicial and military rank, men from the harem, who are men among women, women among men, whose only manliness consisted in their impiety, and being incapable of natural licentiousness, commit fornication in the only way they can, with their tongues. The chief cook Nebuzaradan, who threatened us with the weapons of his art, and was dispatched by his own fire. But what especially excites my wonder, and what I could not, even if I would, pass by, I will describe as concisely as possible. Who has not heard of the prefect of those days, who for his own part treated us with such excessive arrogance, having himself been admitted, or perhaps committed, to baptism by the other party, and strove by exceeding the letter of his instructions, and gratifying his master in every particular, to guarantee and preserve his own possession of power? Though he raged against the Church, and assumed a lion-like aspect, and roared like a lion till most men dared not approach him, yet our noble prelate was brought into, or rather entered, his court, as if bidden to a feast, instead of to a trial. How can I fully describe either the arrogance of the prefect, or the prudence with which it was met by the saint? What is the meaning, Sir Basil, he said, addressing him by name, and not as yet deigning to term him bishop, of your daring, as no other dares, to resist and oppose so great a potentate? In what respect, said our noble champion, and in what does my rashness consist? For this I have yet to learn. In refusing to respect the religion of your sovereign, when all others have yielded and submitted themselves. Because, said he, this is not the will of my real sovereign, nor can I, who am a creature of God, and bidden myself to be God, submit to worship any creature. And what do we, said the prefect, seem to you to be? Are we, who give you this injunction, nothing at all? What do you say to this? Is it not a great thing to be ranged with us as your associates? You are, I will not deny it, said he, a prefect, and an illustrious one, yet not of more honour than God. And to be associated with you is a great thing certainly, for you are yourself the creature of God, but so it is to be associated with any other of my subjects. For faith, and not personal importance, is the distinctive mark of Christianity. Then indeed the prefect became excited, and rose from his seat, boiling with rage, and making use of harsher language. What, said he, have you no fear of my authority? Fear of what? Said Basil. How could it affect me? Of what? Of any one of the resources of my power. What are these? Said Basil. Pray inform me. Confiscation, banishment, torture, death. Have you no other threat? Said he, for none of these can reach me. How indeed is that? Said the prefect. Because, he replied, a man who has nothing is beyond the reach of confiscation, unless you demand my tattered rags, and the few books which are my only possessions. Banishment is impossible for me, who am confined by no limit of place, counting my own neither the land where I now dwell, nor all of that into which I may be hurled, or rather, counting it all God's, whose guest and dependent I am. As for tortures, what hold can they have upon one whose body has ceased to be? Unless you mean the first stroke, for this alone is in your power. Death is my benefactor, for it will send me the sooner to God, for whom I live, and exist, and have all but died, and to whom I have been long hastening. Amazed at this language, the prefect said, No one has ever yet spoken thus, and with such boldness, to Modestus. Why, perhaps, said Basil, you have not met with a bishop, or in his defence of such interest he would have used precisely the same language. For we are modest in general, and submissive to every one, according to the precept of our law. We may not treat with haughtiness even any ordinary person, to say nothing of so great a potentate. But where the interests of God are at stake, we care for nothing else, and make these our sole object. Fire and sword and wild beast, and rakes which tear the flesh, we revel in, and fear them not. You may further insult and threaten us, and do whatever you will, to the full extent of your power. The Emperor himself may hear this, that neither by violence nor persuasion will you bring us to make common cause with impiety, not even though your threats become still more terrible." At the close of this colloquy, the prefect, having been convinced by the attitude of Basil that he was absolutely impervious to threats and influence, dismissed him from the court, his former threatening manner being replaced by somewhat of respect and deference. He himself with all speed obtained an audience of the Emperor and said, "We have been worsted, sire, by the prelate of this church. He is superior to threats, invincible in argument, uninfluenced by persuasion. We must make trial of some more feeble character, and in this case resort to open violence, or submit to the disregard of our threatenings." Hereupon the Emperor, forced by the praises of Basil to condemn his own conduct, for even an enemy can admire a man's excellence, would not allow violence to be used against him, and, like iron, which is softened by fire, yet still remains iron, though turned from threatening to admiration, would not enter into communion with him, being prevented by shame from changing his course, but sought to justify his conduct by the more plausible excuse he could, as the sequel will show. For he entered the church attended by the whole of his train. It was the festival of the Epiphany, and the church was crowded, and by taking his place among the people, he made a profession of unity. The occurrence is not to be lightly passed over. Upon his entrance he was struck by the thundering roll of the psalms, by the sea of heads of the congregation, and by the angelic rather than human order which pervaded the sanctuary and its precincts. While Basil presided over his people, standing erect, as the Scripture says of Samuel, with body and eyes and mind undisturbed, as if nothing new had happened, but fixed upon God and the sanctuary, as if, so to say, he had been a statue, while his ministers stood around him in fear and reverence. At this sight, and it was indeed a sight unparalleled, overcome by human weakness, his eyes were affected with dimness and giddiness, his mind with dread. This was as yet unnoticed by most people. But when he had to offer the gifts at the table of God, which he must needs do himself, since no one would, as usual, assist him, because it was uncertain whether Basil would admit him, his feelings were revealed. For he was staggering, and had not someone in the sanctuary reached out a hand to steady his tottering steps, he would have sunk to the ground in a lamentable fall. So much for this. As for the wisdom of his conference with the Emperor, who, in his quasi-communion with us, entered within the veil to see and speak to him, as he had long desired to do, what else can I say but that they were inspired words, which were heard by the courtiers and by us who had entered with them? This was the beginning and first establishment of the Emperor's kindly feeling towards us. The impression produced by this reception put an end to the greater part of the persecution which assailed us like a river. Another incident is not of less importance than those I have mentioned. The wicked were victorious, and the decree for his banishment was signed, to the full satisfaction of those who furthered it. The night had come, the chariot was ready, our haters were exultant, the pious in despair. We surrounded the zealous traveller, to whose honourable disgrace nothing was wanting. What next? It was undone by God. For he who smote the firstborn of Egypt for its harshness towards Israel, also struck the son of the emperor with disease. How great was the speed! There was the sentence of banishment, here the decree of sickness. The hand of the wicked scribe was restrained, and the saint was preserved, and the man of piety presented to us by the fever which brought to reason the arrogance of the emperor. What could be more just or more speedy than this? This was the series of events. The emperor's child was sick and in bodily pain. The father was pained for it, for what can the father do? On all sides he sought for aid in his distress. He summoned the best physicians. He betook himself to intercessions with the greatest fervour, and flung himself upon the ground. Affliction humbles even emperors, and no wonder, for the like sufferings of David in the case of his child are recorded for us. But as no cure for the evil could anywhere be found, he applied to the faith of Basil, not personally summoning him, in shame for his recent ill treatment, but entrusting the mission to others of his nearest and dearest friends. On his arrival, without the delay or reluctance which any one else might have shown, at once the disease relaxed, and the father cherished better hopes. And had he not blended salt water with the fresh, by trusting to the heterodox at the same time that he summoned Basil, the child would have recovered his health and been preserved for his father's arms. This indeed was the conviction of those who were present at the time, and shared in the distress. The same mischance is said to have befallen the prefect. He also was obliged by sickness to bow beneath the hands of the saint, and in reality to men of sense a visitation brings instruction, and affliction is often better than prosperity. He fell sick, was in tears, and in pain. He sent for Basil, and entreated him, crying out, "I own that you were in the right, only save me." His request was granted, as he himself acknowledged, and convinced many who would know nothing of it, for he never ceased to wonder at and describe the powers of the prelate. Such was his conduct in these cases, such its result. Did he then treat others in a different way, and engage in petty disputes about trifles, or fail to rise to the heights of philosophy in a course of action which merits no praise and is best passed over in silence? By no means. He who once stirred up the wicked Hadad against Israel, stirred up against him the prefect of the province of Pontus, nominally from annoyance connected with some poor creature of a woman, but in reality as a part of the struggle of impiety against the truth. I pass by all his other insults against Basil, or, for it is the same thing, against God. For it is against him and on his behalf that the contest was waged. One instance of it, however, which brought special disgrace upon the assailant and exalted his adversary, if philosophy and eminence for it be a great and lofty thing, I will describe at length. The assessor of a judge was attempting to force into a distasteful marriage a lady of high birth whose husband was but recently dead. At a loss to escape from this high-handed treatment, she resorted to a device no less prudent than daring. She fled to the holy table, and placed herself under the protection of God against outrage. What, in the name of the Trinity itself, if I may introduce into my panegyric somewhat of the forensic style, ought to have been done, I do not say, by the great Basil, who laid down the law for us all in such matters, but by any one who, though far inferior to him, was a priest. Ought he not to have allowed her claim, to have taken charge of and cared for her, to have raised his hand in defence of the kindness of God and the law which gives honour to the altar? Ought he not to have been willing to do and suffer anything, rather than take part in any inhuman design against her, and outrage at once the holy table, and the faith in which she had taken sanctuary? No, said the baffled judge, all ought to yield to my authority, and Christians should betray their own laws. The suppliant whom he demanded was at all hazards retained. Accordingly, in his rage, he at last sent some of the magistrates to search the saint's bedchamber, with the purpose of dishonouring him, rather than from any necessity. What? Search the house of a man so free from passion, whom the angels revere, at whom women do not venture even to look. And not content with this, he summoned him, and put him on his defence, and that in no gentle or kindly manner, but as if he were a convict. Upon Basil's appearance, standing, like my Jesus, before the judgment seat of Pilate, he presided at the trial, full of wrath and pride. Yet the thunderbolts did not fall, and the sword of God still glittered and waited, while his bow, though bent, was restrained. Such indeed is the custom of God. Consider another struggle between our champion and his persecutor. His ragged pallium having been ordered to be torn away, "I will also, if you wish it, strip off my coat," said he. His fleshless form was threatened by blows, and he offered to submit to be torn with combs, and he said, "By such laceration you will cure my liver, which as you see is wearing me away." Such was their argument. But when the city perceived the outrage and the common danger of all, for each one considered this insolence a danger to himself, it became all on fire with rage, and, like a hive roused by smoke, one after another was stirred and arose, every race and every age, but especially the men from the small arms factory, and from the imperial weaving sheds. For men at work in these trades are specially hot-tempered and daring, because of the liberty allowed them. Each man was armed with the tool he was using, or with whatever else came to hand at the moment, torch in hand, amid showers of stones, with cudgels ready, all ran and shouted together in their united zeal. Anger makes a terrible soldier or general. Nor were the women weaponless, when roused by such an occasion. Their pins were their spears, and, no longer remaining women, they were by the strength of their eagerness endowed with masculine courage. It is a short story. They thought that they would share among themselves the piety of destroying him, and held him to be most pious who first laid hands on one who had dared such deeds. What then was the conduct of this haughty and daring judge? He begged for mercy in a pitiable state of distress, cringing before them to an unparalleled extent, until the arrival of the martyr without bloodshed, who had won his crown without blows, and now restrained a people by the force of his personal influence, and delivered the man who had insulted him and now sought his protection. This was the doing of the God of saints, who worketh and changeth all things for the best, who resisteth the proud, but giveth grace to the humble. And why should not he, who divided the sea and stayed the river, and ruled the elements, and by stretching out set up a trophy, to save his exiled people, why should not he have also rescued this man from his perils? This was the end and fortunate close in the providence of God of the war with the world, a close worthy of his faith. But here at once is the beginning of the war with the bishops and their allies, which involved great disgrace, and still greater injury to their subjects. For who could persuade others to be temperate, when such was the conduct of their prelates? For a long time they had been unkindly disposed towards him, on three grounds. They neither agreed with him in the matter of the faith, except in so far as they were absolutely obliged to yield to the majority of the faithful, nor had they altogether laid aside the grudge they owed him for his election. And what was most grievous of all to them, though they would have been most ashamed to own it, he so far outshone them in reputation. There was also a further cause of dissension which stirred up again the others. When our country had been divided into two provinces and metropolitical sees, and a great part of the former was being added to the new one, this again roused their factious spirit. The one thought it right that the ecclesiastical boundaries should be settled by the civil ones, and therefore claimed those newly added as belonging to him, and severed from their former metropolitan. The other clung to the ancient custom, and to the division which had come down from our fathers. Many painful results either actually followed, or were struggling in the womb of the future. Synods were wrongfully gathered by the new metropolitan, and revenues seized upon. Some of the presbyters of the churches refused obedience, others were won over. In consequence, the affairs of the churches fell into a sad state of dissension and division. Novelty indeed has a certain charm for men, and they readily turn events to their own advantage, and it is easier to overthrow something which is already established than to restore it when overthrown. What however enraged him most was, that the revenues of the Taurus, which passed along before his eyes, accrue to his rival, as also the offerings at St. Orestes, of which he was greatly desirous to reap the fruits. He even went so far as, on one occasion when Basil was riding along his own road, to seize his mules by the bridle and bar the passage with a robber band. And with how specious a pretext, the care of his spiritual children and of the souls entrusted to him, and the defence of the faith, pretexts which veiled that most common vice, insatiable avarice, and further, the wrongfulness of paying dues to heretics, a heretic being any one who had displeased him. The holy man of God, however, metropolitan as he was of the true Jerusalem above, was neither carried away with the failure of those who fell, nor allowed himself to overlook this conduct, nor did he desire any inadequate remedy for the evil. Let us see how great and wonderful it was, or I would say, how worthy of his soul. He made of the dissension a cause of increase to the Church, and the disaster, under his most able management, resulted in the multiplication of the bishops of the country. From this ensued three most desirable consequences: a greater care for souls, the management of each city of its own affairs, and the cessation of the war in this quarter. I am afraid that I myself was treated as an appendage to this scheme. By no other term can I readily describe the position. Greatly as I admire his whole conduct, to an extent indeed beyond my powers of expression, of this single particular I find it impossible to approve, for I will acknowledge my feelings in regard to it, though these are from other sources not unknown to most of you. I mean the change and faithlessness of his treatment of myself, a cause of pain which even time is not obliterated. For this is the source of all the inconsistency and tangle of my life. It has robbed me of the practice, or at least of the reputation, of philosophy, a small moment though the latter be. The defence, which you will perhaps allow me to make for him, is this. His ideas were superhuman, and having, before his death, become superior to worldly influences, his only interests were those of the Spirit, while his regard for friendship was in no wise lessened by his readiness then, and then only, to disregard its claims, when they were in conflict with his paramount duty to God, and when the end he had in view was of greater importance than the interest he was compelled to set aside. I am afraid that, in avoiding the imputation of indifference at the hands of those who desire to know all that can be said about him, I shall incur a charge of prolixity from those whose ideal is the golden mean. For the latter Basil himself had the greatest respect, being specially devoted to the adage, "In all things the mean is the best," and acting upon it throughout his life. Nevertheless, disregarding alike those who desire undue conciseness or excessive prolixity, I proceed thus with my speech. Different men attain success in different ways, some applying themselves to one alone of the many forms of excellence, but no one, of those hitherto known to me, arriving at the highest eminence in all respects. He being in my opinion the best, who has won his laurels on the widest field, or gained the highest possible renown in some single particular. Such, however, was the height of Basil's fame, that he became the pride of humankind. Let us consider the matter thus. Is any one devoted to poverty and a life devoid of property, and free from superfluity? What did he possess besides his body, and the necessary coverings of the flesh? His wealth was the having nothing, and he thought the cross, with which he lived, more precious than great riches. For no one, however much he may wish, can obtain possession of all things. But any one can learn to despise, and so prove himself superior to, all things. This being his mind, and such his life, he had no need of an altar and of vainglory, nor of such a public announcement as Crates sets Crates the Theban free. For his aim was ever to be, not to seem, most excellent. Nor did he dwell in a tub, and in the midst of the marketplace, and so by luxuriating in publicity turn his poverty into riches, but was poor and unkempt, yet without ostentation, and taking cheerfully the casting overboard of all that he ever had, sailed lightly across the sea of life. A wonderful thing is temperance and fewness of wants, and freedom from the dominion of pleasures, and from the bondage of that cruel and degrading mistress, the belly. Who was so independent of food, and, without exaggeration, more free from the flesh? For he flung away all satiety and surfeit to creatures destitute of reason, whose life is slavish and debasing. He paid little attention to such things as, next to the appetite, are of equal rank, but, as far as possible, lived on the merest necessaries, his only luxury being to prove himself not luxurious, and not, in consequence, to have greater needs. But he looked to the lilies and the birds, whose beauty is artless, and their food casual, according to the important advice of my Christ, who made himself poor in the flesh for our sakes, that we might enjoy the riches of his Godhead. Hence came his single coat and well-worn cloak, and his bed on the bare ground, his vigils, his unwashedness, such were his decorations, and his most sweet food and relish, bread and salt, his new dainty, and the sober and plentiful drink, with which fountains supply those who are free from trouble. The result, or the accompaniment, of these things were the attendance on the sick and practice of medicine, our common intellectual pursuit, for though inferior to him in all other respects, I must needs be his equal in distress. A great thing is virginity, and celibacy, and being ranked with the angels, and with a single nature. For I shrink from calling it Christ, who, though he willed to be born for our sakes who are born, by being born of a virgin, enacted the law of virginity, to lead us away from this life, and cut short the power of the world, or rather, to transmit one world to another, the present to the future. Who then paid more honour to virginity, or had more control of the flesh, not only by his personal example, but in those under his care? Whose are the convents and the written regulations, by which he subdued every sense, and regulated every member, and won to the real practice of virginity, turning inward the view of beauty, from the visible to the invisible, and by wasting away the external, and withdrawing fuel from the flame, and revealing the secrets of the heart to God, who is the only bridegroom of pure souls, and takes in with himself the watchful souls, if they go to meet him with lamps burning and a plentiful supply of oil. Moreover, he reconciled most excellently and united the solitary and the community life. These had been in many respects at variance and dissension, while neither of them was in absolute and unalloyed possession of good or evil, the one being more calm and settled, tending to union with God, yet not free from pride, inasmuch as its virtue lies beyond the means of testing or comparison. The other, which is of more practical service, being not free from the tendency to turbulence. He founded cells for ascetics and hermits, but at no great distance from his Cenobitic communities, and instead of distinguishing and separating the one from the other, as if by some intervening wall, he brought them together and united them, in order that the contemplative spirit might not be cut off from society, nor the active life be uninfluenced by the contemplative, but that, like sea and land, by an interchange of their several gifts, they might unite in promoting the one object, the glory of God. What more? A noble thing is philanthropy, and the support of the poor, and the assistance of human weakness. Go forth a little way from the city, and behold the new city, the storehouse of piety, the common treasury of the wealthy, in which the superfluities of their wealth, ay, and even their necessaries, are stored, in consequence of his exhortations, freed from the power of the moth, no longer gladdening the eyes of the thief, and escaping both the emulation of envy and the corruption of time. where disease is regarded in a religious light, and disaster is thought a blessing, and sympathy is put to the test. Why should I compare with this work Thebes of the seen portals, and the Egyptian Thebes, and the walls of Babylon, and the Carian tomb of Mopsulos, and the pyramids, and the bronze without weight of the Colossus, or the size and beauty of shrines that are no more, and all the other objects of men's wonder and historic record, from which their founders gained no advantage, except a slight meed of fame? My subject is the most wonderful of all, the short road to salvation, the easiest ascent to heaven. There is no longer before our eyes that terrible and piteous spectacle of men who are living corpses, the greater part of whose limbs have mortified, driven away from their cities and homes and public places and fountains, ay, and from their own dearest ones, recognizable by their names rather than by their features. They are no longer brought before us at our gatherings and meetings, in our common intercourse and union, no longer the objects of hatred, instead of pity on account of their disease. Composers of piteous songs, if any of them have their voice still left to them. Why should I try to express in tragic style all our experiences, when no language can be adequate to their hard lot? He, however, it was, who took the lead in pressing upon those who were men, that they ought not to despise their fellow men, nor to dishonour Christ, the one head of all, by their inhuman treatment of them, but to use the misfortunes of others as an opportunity of firmly establishing their own lot, and to lend to God that mercy of which they stand in need at His hands. He did not therefore disdain to honour with his lips this disease, noble and of noble ancestry and brilliant reputation though he was, but saluted them as brethren, not, as some might suppose, from vainglory, for who was so far removed from this feeling, but taking the lead in approaching to tend them, as a consequence of his philosophy, and so giving not only a speaking, but also a silent instruction. The effect produced is to be seen not only in the city, but in the country and beyond, and even the leaders of society have vied with one another in their philanthropy and magnanimity towards them. Others have had their cooks, and splendid tables, and devices and dainties of confectioners, and exquisite carriages, and soft flowing robes. Basil's care was for the sick, and the relief of their wounds, and the imitation of Christ, by cleansing leprosy, not by a word, but in deed. End of Oration 43, Part 3.